In a previous video, we talked about the startup funding plan. In this video, we'll focus more on the question of exactly how do you decide how much money to raise in a particular funding round. Hi, I'm Steve Morris, and I use this Startup SOS channel to provide practical how-to advice for first-time entrepreneurs. So we talked in that previous video about the idea of a funding plan, how it's essentially a sequence of milestones, how many dollars are required to meet that milestone, and what source might you raise that funding from. The idea is to sort of think through step by step for each stage in your company, what funding you'll need and what milestones you'll need to hit. Now, of course, as you learn more, you make more headway, your funding plan will change and get much more detailed. But it definitely helps to start out with a basic funding plan. But where do these milestones come from in the first place? How do you get started, and how do you decide how much money to raise for each milestone? Well, as you'll see, it is definitely an iterative process that you'll go through multiple times. And of course, the more you learn, the more you'll tweak it and adjust it over time also. But it starts with the milestones that just make sense for your business. If you set aside the funding requirements for just a minute, think through what do you need to accomplish to both develop and then roll out a product. It makes usually a lot of sense to start by testing your idea. That includes customer discovery to see if you build it, will they buy it, but also testing all the other assumptions or hypotheses in your business model. In other words, the things that are documented, hopefully, in your business model canvas. So testing almost always makes sense. Usually makes sense to develop some level of prototype. Maybe even multiple levels of prototype. Maybe a very simple, non-functional prototype that gives a prospective customer an idea of what the product will look like, and then maybe a little more functional prototype that a customer can actually get their hands on and experiment with some. Usually makes sense then to develop that into something a little closer to a real product, let's say a beta test level product, so you can get even more concrete feedback from customers. And it often makes sense to do a limited launch, so that you get some real feedback on whether or not people will actually pay for what you have. And then, of course, a larger launch. So these are very typical steps. But the question is, what makes sense for your particular product? There may be more detailed steps. You may need to do, for example, a lab bench level prototype to sort of prove the basic technology at a small scale, and then a little larger prototype to prove that your technology works at a larger scale. That's a very common sequence you'll see in chemistry or material science kinds of approaches. So it all depends on how you need to develop your product and then ultimately how you're going to take your product to market. So start by just thinking through what milestones make sense for your business. Once you've thought through the milestones that make sense, then you're going to start with the first milestone, run through the whole list, and in each case, you're going to ask some specific questions. Question number one, how many dollars are required to actually accomplish that particular milestone? Now, that is going to take some bottom-up planning. By bottom-up, I mean thinking step by step, day by day, week by week, month by month, what has to happen, and what's that going to cost in terms of people, capital, outside services, and so forth. What is it going to take to actually fund that particular milestone? You certainly have to come up with some idea of the estimate. And as we mentioned in the previous video, you need to add a little more money to that requirement then, because once you reach the milestone, you'll have to have enough cash left to raise that next round of funding or to get into enough revenue so you have revenue to survive on. Okay, so figuring out the required dollars is step one. Next question is, what are the available sources at that particular milestone, given whatever other milestones you've already accomplished? What resources for funding are available to you? If you're at the idea stage, there won't be very many other sources available other than, say, resources of the founders, savings and credit cards and so forth. But if you've made more headway, that opens up additional sources. How do you figure out what sources are available to you? You talk to other entrepreneurs, you talk to investors, you do your homework and figure out really for that particular stage, what should you have available to you? Then the next question is, what's the funding capacity of those sources? The sources that you've made enough headway, these are the sources actually available. Well, can they fund the amount of money you need? For example, if you figure you really need a very functional prototype and it's going to cost $1 million, Now, friends and family might not be a feasible source of that because they might not have the funding capacity to write enough checks to fund $1 million. You may have to look at a later stage approach like, say, angels to have that kind of funding capacity. So clearly what you're trying to figure out is, of the available sources to you given your stage for this particular milestone, is there a source that has the capacity to provide the funding that you need? You know what you need because you figured that out in the earlier step of figuring out the dollars required. Okay, so let's say you have an available source that does have the capacity. Next question to ask is this particular milestone a fundable milestone? In other words, if you raise the money and accomplish this milestone, does it position you to then raise money to hit the next milestone in your funding plan? How do you figure that out? Well, again, you go do your homework. You talk to other entrepreneurs, you talk to investors, you try to figure out whether your idea of a fundable milestone makes sense in the current funding market. All right, so let's say you got the source, it has the capacity, it is a fundable milestone. Final question to ask is, how about the dilution impact? The more money you raise to hit a particular milestone, the higher the dilution will be in terms of your ownership or the founding team ownership of the company. Now, there's always going to be dilution when you raise money from investors. That's just the way it is. And as long as you're increasing the value of the company, dilution is not a bad thing. Your value keeps increasing as long as the value you create increases faster than the dilution. But you want to at least take a look at dilution, because if you are taking a huge hit from a dilution point of view, it's worth stepping back and saying, maybe we should identify a smaller, less expensive milestone that we could hit to increase our value more before we tackle that more expensive milestone. And that's part of the iterative aspect of figuring out your funding plan. Whatever here in the process you go through doesn't make sense. Say you can't find the available resource that has the funding capacity, or you figure it's not a fundable milestone for the next step, or the dilution impact is too high. If one of those doesn't make sense, you're backing up, rethinking the milestone, seeing if you can ratchet it back some, or in some cases, if it's not a fundable milestone, you actually have to build it up some. You have to do something maybe a little more aggressive and see if that fits more into a feasible funding plan. So very much iterative. It takes multiple passes through this to figure it out. And as you get more experience and learn more, your perspective will change, your funding plan will change. But hopefully that gives you a feel for some of the questions that you ask along the way. So just as an example, let's say you're looking at a prototyping milestone and you do a bottom-up cash flow to figure out what it's going to cost you to hit that milestone. Now, I'm going to take this milestone from the previous video we did on the funding plan, and the number was $50,000. You believe that would cover the actual development cost, the cost of doing the customer testing to get the feedback, and then to still have money left over so you have cash runway to go through a funding process to do the next raise to hit the next milestone, which would probably be to develop a more complete product, maybe a beta test level product. So that's the process you go through to size that particular round. Then the next question is, what sources could fund that amount of money? Well, for $50,000, you may well have enough of a network of friends and family that could be a source. You might have some seed funds you potentially have access to that could fund that much money, or an accelerator program. Any of those might be a potential as you take a look at, do you have access to them, and do they have the capacity to actually fund $50,000? Let's say you decide, actually any of those three could fund $50,000, but you decide what you'll target is friends and family because you think that is the most likely source of funding for that $50K. Next, you ask, is this a fundable milestone? If we go ahead and accomplish this milestone of developing the kind of prototype that we have in mind, will it give us the credibility that we need, the credibility in showing we can develop at least a prototype product, we can get positive feedback from customers? Will that give us enough credibility to raise funding for the next step being that beta test product? Now, assuming you convince yourself that yes, it will do that, Well, then you can take a look at the last question, which is one of dilution. Is this a reasonable amount of dilution? Well, for the $50,000, you're probably going to raise that through a convertible note or a pre-money safe, so there's no immediate dilution impact. But thinking down the road, whenever you do get your first priced round and those funds will convert, whether it's a safe or a convertible note, into stock, yeah, $50,000 shouldn't be a huge impact. I mean, odds are good that your pre-money value later, when you do a priced round, will be in the millions of dollars, probably low millions, but at least in the millions. So yeah, $50,000 doesn't feel like a major hit to your dilution. So yes, that feels like a credible milestone. You check that one off and you proceed to the next one and go through exactly the same sequence of questions. So again, in summary, those are the questions to think about in terms of sizing each particular milestone in your funding plan. But remember, you're always looking at the next milestone as part of your assessment of the current milestone to see if it is a feasible, practical part of your funding plan. If this was helpful, please click the like button and share it with other entrepreneurs. Any questions or comments, please leave a comment. And if you haven't yet subscribed, please click that subscribe button and click on the bell so you get notified of the next video, because there's more to come in this sequence on funding strategy. And of course, there's a link right here to the playlist for the entire sequence of videos. That's it for now. Thank you very much for watching.